Clyde, Clyde, help me with Clyde. Anyway, Jonathan Clyde.
Ah.
And they are the two people who run Apple for John, for Paul and Ringo and Olivia Harrison and Yoko Ono. And they have a one-fourth piece, and they meet a couple of times a year, and they decide what to do. And they told me about a project that they call Beatles Live, where they spent 7 years through a group called One World, collecting everything they can find about the Beatles' performances from 1962 and a little earlier through the time they stopped touring in 1966. And they said, we've read Ticket to Ride, your book, and we really feel that you should come and be interviewed by us. And we signed a contract, and I went out to Hollywood, and I did a bunch of hours of interviewing. And as the months progressed, they asked me for an outline of what I thought the news-making events were for the Beatles tours.
Wow.
So I gave them a written outline about 2-3 pages, and they stuck to the script, and they asked me questions about that in a place called the Laugh Factory, which is an old nightclub on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood. And we did the interview, and that was that. I went home, and they kept calling me to do what they call pickup lines, where I go into a studio and elaborate on some of the things I said. And I just happened to know 2 students from the Berklee College of Music in Boston who had a studio. And I don't know how they did it, but they completely matched the sound to the sound in the Hollywood studio. Then they asked me to come out for more interviews, and I got kind of close to some of the producers and talked to Ron Howard once. And then around this time last year, my wife and I were invited to go to, and I'm sure you know the place, it's on Park Avenue, around 60-something. It's a little screening room.
Yes.
And I walked in the screening room, and I didn't know what to make of it. I just thought it was nice that they were going to show me the rough cut of the movie. And as I walked into the room, half the people there got up and applauded. So I said, what's this about? What's this about? And then Ron Howard came up to me and said, congratulations. So I watched the movie and realized that I was in about 45% of it. And that stunned me, first of all. But there's something that happened. On the way home, driving down, I live in Philadelphia, driving down the turnpike, my wife said to me, what was it like? I said, I have to tell you, it was like being there again. When I heard
Is that what it felt like?
When I heard my voice from the past and watched the way he put this movie together, I said I was getting chills. I thought that I was there again.
Wow.
And if I was getting chills and I was there, I can imagine how people would feel. So it kept going on, and they asked for more material as the year progressed. And then in the middle of 2016, I got a call from Ron Howard and the producers Scott Piscucci and Nigel Sinclair, and they invited me to come to the premiere in England. And they also invited my wife, but my daughter had just had her third grandchild. She's been trying for a girl, and she had her third boy, and she was overwhelmed. My wife wanted to stay home and help her, so I went, flew there, and had 3 of the most magical days. And to this day, I'm astounded that I'm in the movie as much as I am.
Well, it needs a through line. It needs a narrator. What the greatest thing out of the movie is that we hear this live music that we've never heard before. What we hear is some sound through screaming. And what I've always tried to explain to people, when we heard Live at Shea or Hollywood Bowl album, you hear screaming and a little bit of music. It's as if the mics were facing the crowd. They weren't. That was how loud the crowd was on the stage level. And George Martin's son, Giles, is Gandalf. He is a wizard when it comes to, he was on the show of when the album first came out. And I said, is it just, how do you do that? How do you take source material? And he said, now with the computers, you sample it, this crowd, you take it out, and then you put the music, and it's almost like cleaning the Sistine Chapel piece by piece.
Well,
you put it together.
what he did was, I chatted with him for a long time during my Abbey Road visit, and he took the sound out, which allowed all of you and anybody who sees the film to, and I want to tell you a little bit about the business of the film a little later too.
Yeah.
To hear them. For example, the first thing you see of them is a concert in Birmingham or Manchester.
Yeah, yeah.
The ABC Theater in Manchester. And what you're doing is you're hearing what I heard at 57 concerts. And what I heard when I cupped my ears in a certain way was the Beatles on stage sounding exactly like they did on the record. It's the way they said it then. Today it would be on the MP3. And it was unbelievable how good they were. They came out, they sang their songs, they didn't say much in between. They were absolutely perfect in person, except for Shea Stadium, and that was because they didn't know what song they were playing at the time. In fact, at one of the concerts, they were playing separate songs. And the only way Ringo could figure out what they were doing is he would look at the behinds, the butts of the other players, and
Just
figure
to
out
know
what
where they were in the song.
In the song. So that was one thing about the film. The other thing about the film that was truly amazing is that they went in deeply into this Jacksonville story, where I had told them in Las Vegas that the Jacksonville Gator Bowl was going to be segregated. And in their contracts, was a proviso that they would not play before any audience that wasn't inclusive. So they decided they're not going to play. And I thought Brian was going to have a collapse because he just didn't know how to handle it.
He's trying to avoid conflict.
Yeah.
And they dove right in.
And then they dove right in, and it took them from November, August 21st till the concert was on September 11th till about September 10th to finally work this thing out. And they found Kitty Oliver, this woman.
That was one of the most powerful parts of the entire movie to me. That was brilliant.
Yeah, who is black and who's an historian. She's got a PhD in history and teaches college down in Florida. And they found her today talking about the experience then. And it's hard for us to imagine, if we're not in this situation, sitting in that stadium with 2,000 other people of color was the first time she ever talked to a white person in her life. First time she ever went to a bathroom that wasn't designated colored. And so it was truly a moment of history made possible by the Beatles. And because the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville was one of the star locations of the Southeastern Conference football, after that moment, every other stadium was integrated in the South. And it became quite a moment.
It's incredible. What Whoopi Goldberg says in the film, I wasn't black, I was a Beatle fan.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of weight to such a simple statement. You know, I wasn't a black kid. My mom knew what it meant to me. Just a Beatle fan, like white guy, white girl. You know, you want to talk about uniting things, and yet what you paint through the story is the backdrop of what's happening. There's the Vietnam War. We've got segregation in the South. We're fighting it in the North. There's so much going on in the world. And one of the things, I don't know if you know about Larry or not, is when Larry got the call, he didn't want to go on tour with the Beatles. You should mention that briefly. You're in Miami.
Most of you have seen the movies, so you know what happened, but it was a big time in Miami. Every week, 4,000 or 5,000 people were coming from Cuba. And I had flown over the Florida Straits with the U.S. Coast Guard, where they were keeping track of the people, some of them in cardboard boats, just trying to save themselves. And eventually, as we all know, the Cuban-American population became one of the most powerful populations in America and completely changed not just the complexion of South Florida, but Miami became a big city and a successful city because of the Cuban population. And to me, that was a gigantic story. The Vietnam War was escalating. We had a new president. We were living in the aftermath of the death and murder of President Kennedy, which, by the way, I've linked in my books to the rise of the Beatles, because their first record was formally released in America, formally, on December 26th, 1963.
Wow.
23 days after the murder of the president. It was really a welcome relief. It was, sort of a diversion. And when I wrote that, people accused me of being an amateur sociologist, and I'm not a sociologist, but I felt there was a connection. And now everybody's writing about that. They were amazing, and when I first met them, the first meeting with them was not too spectacular. I had, and I'll tell you a quick story about that. I have not told this story in a book, but I met them in San Francisco. I had interviewed them briefly in Miami, and I went from the airport to the hotel. It was the San Francisco Hilton. The same hotel still stands today. And I went to my room, and I opened the door. This is about 50 feet away from their room. And I opened the door of the room, and sitting on the couch was one of the most beautiful people I'd ever seen. She may be in the audience tonight, I don't know. But she was, at the time, was in her mid-20s, and she was gorgeous, and she was wearing a mini skirt. And I'd never seen a hemline that high in my life. And she looked at me. I said, "Am I in the wrong room?" And she says, "No, Mr. Kayne, I am. I was the stewardess on your plane, and I heard you talking about traveling with the Beatles. And I checked in under your name," and she looked at me straight in my eyes without flinching and said, "I am here to make you so happy that you will get me to meet the Beatles tonight." Now,
May I just interrupt for 1 second? That doesn't happen a whole lot to Jewish kids who are on the radio. I would just like to point that out in any generation.
Well,
please now continue the story.
Now, needless to say, I was had really mixed emotions. I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but I was scared, not of the potential for having a good time, but the fact that maybe she was a stalker. She was 50 feet away from the Beatles' room. I didn't even know them that well, and I just didn't know what to do. And the phone rang, and Derek Taylor, their wonderful traveling press secretary, called me and said, "Come on down and meet the boys. We're going to have all the people traveling on the plane." That's some people from Australia, a few from Britain, and me. And I said to her, "I'll be right back." And I went to the room, met Paul, lovely, personal, charming as always. George Harrison was reading at the time, a Green Hornet comic book, and smoking. Everybody was smoking. I was smoking, just cigarettes at that time. And I met Ringo, who is very intellectual. I mean, very serious, a very serious guy about the world. And then I met George and chatted, and then I met John. Now, after this first meeting, you'd think it would all be over, because he looked at me, and for those of you old enough, I was wearing a Robert Hall suit. A few of you remember that. That was like the Men's Warehouse, but at a much lower level. And it was the only suit I owned. It was the bar mitzvah suit,
Right.
the one suit your mother bought for you that she picked out. And he looked at me up and down, and he said, "Who are you? Where do you come from? You look like a nerd from the 1950s. And I said, because I didn't want to go. And I said, "Well, who the hell do you think you are?
Nice.
You don't cut your hair. You look like a slob." And, I was kind of angry. So then I started asking him questions about the war in Vietnam, racism in England, racism in America, Martin Luther King, and he just lit up. And that was the secret of my relationship with the Beatles. I asked them serious questions, and they had intellect, and they didn't want to be just viewed as four mop tops, and they wanted to be viewed seriously. And so I figured, my career is over. I'll never see the inside of that plane. I walked out of the room, And all of a sudden, I feel two hands on my shoulder and somebody gripping my chest and turning me around. And it was John. He ran out. And I'll tell you, if you've read my book, Lennon Revealed, or anything I've written about him, you know we were close, but that he also wasn't a very huggy-kissy kind of guy, in person anyway, in public. And he said, "I'm so sorry, mate." He said, "I'm really looking forward to traveling with you, and I'm sorry about what I said." And I realized that he was quite a guy. So now I have to deal with a woman.
Meanwhile, back at the ranch.
And I look down the hall and I see Malcolm Evans, who's a man I loved, their stage manager, whose parents, by the way, I met at parents, his brothers and sisters and sons and daughters I met at the premiere. And they were in such tears because I featured him in all my books. And Malcolm was walking with a young woman with a blue coat on, and she was doing everything you can do to a man in public without being arrested. In the old days of Philadelphia, she would have been arrested immediately on the street. And it was her. I never saw her again. But I can guarantee you she got to meet the Beatles that night. And that was my first date. But
That's a hell of a start, isn't it?
But getting back to this magical 4 days I had in September, they called me and they said, "We want to fly you over first class and want you to help us out." And I did 117 interviews prior to that via Skype and phone and satellite interviews. And I really helped them promote the movie as much as I could. So I arrived in London late morning. They picked me up. They had an escort with me. And the young man took me to the hotel. I slept for a few hours, got up, had dinner with Kitty Oliver, the woman that they found,
Interviewed.
and her boyfriend. And got up the next morning. Car picks me up. Go to Abbey Road. That's where I met Ringo, who said, "I got to have a talk with you, man." He said, "You're much too much in the picture." And that's when he made his comment. And Paul was very excited, and Eric Clapton was there, and it was very exciting. I'd never been to Abbey Road before, and I got the full tour, and it was really great. But that same day, now I want you to think of the calendar. I got picked up by another associate, PR associate, and we went directly to the train station and went to Manchester, which is the home of the BBC.
Right.
And we did some interviews, and the next morning I went on a show called BBC Breakfast. Now, Britain is a nation of about 46 million people. 7 million people watch BBC Breakfast. And the host is like the Matt Lauer of Britain, and her name is Nege. The co-host is like a superstar. And so they interviewed me for about 5 minutes, and then in the break, the host said, "I want to have him on for the whole half hour." And I stayed on and talked about the movie and the premiere. And the host, and if you want to see some of it, you can see this on YouTube. And there's also a reel called Sizzle that's on YouTube of the whole premiere. It's free for anybody to see. The host said to me, "I'm so happy to have you here, but I hope you never come back to this program." And I said, "Why not?" And he embarrassed me because I was so tickled by what he said. He said, "Because you are so good telling a story that I will be replaced overnight." And I said, "That's the only ego I'm going to give into this conversation." And then we did radio with Radio North, which covered Liverpool.
Right.
Then the same day now, this is Thursday, we trained back to London. I get dressed, and if you see in the pictures on the YouTube reel, you'll see that I was dressed to the hilt. I had a handkerchief in my pocket. I was really dressed. And all the reporters were asking me, I was the first one on the blue carpet, "How come you're so dressed up, Mr. Kayne?" And I said, "Well, to be very honest with you, my friends told me to wear a black leather jacket and, black leather pants and a nice suit coat and sneakers, much like Joey had on today.
Yeah.
And because that's the rock and roll look. But I just felt I had to be myself. So then I go on, and they interview me by satellite that goes to 100 theaters, and Madonna comes up. Now, I have to tell you, I hate to say this, but Madonna may be a superstar, but she has no soul. I mean, she looked right through you like, who are you? And then Eric Clapton and a bunch of, I think Dave Grohl was there, and it was a bunch of stars, and I went into the theater, and we sat in the Queen's box on the top, and the show was over, and we had an after party, which is very tame, and McCartney and Ringo were in a little corner, a roped off corner, and they called me in, and Paul almost broke out into tears. He said that was so great, and he said I really hadn't seen it before, and Ringo said, you know, you were in it a lot, but you were really terrific, and I met all the producers, and I have some pictures in my phone of Ron Howard, and me and Paul, and it was just kind of a finale to a 52-year relationship.
Isn't that wonderful?
And
It almost never happens.
Yoko was there. Met Olivia Harrison, who I'd never met before, and the parents of Mal Evans, the relatives of him, were just remarkable because they were crying so hard because I featured him in my books, and I love the guy. And it was just a very special experience. So on Friday, I get up, go to Heathrow Airport, fly into Philadelphia, where the premiere is Saturday night, 2 shows. And the real story of the movie is that the movie was in about 40 theaters nationwide, including the independent one in Manhattan. What do they call? IC.
Yeah, I hosted the one. Little Stephen hosted one as a benefit, and I hosted the one at IFC.
And I eventually spoke there and at NYU, and I started speaking all over the place. And the movie could have been in the theaters for 4 months because they kept packing them, and all these theaters kept extending them. And they raked in about $18 million in movie gross, which for a movie like that is remarkable. Then they put it on Hulu, and then they started selling the DVD packs.
And the DVD, the extra DVD, the extras on it are just absolutely amazing if you've seen that. I have one bone to pick with the movie, and we're Beatle fans, so I can share it. There's one actor in the story that wasn't in the movie, that wasn't told, and I think is an essential part of it, and that's our late friend Sid Bernstein.
Well,
Sid should have been part of that story. They don't come to Shea Stadium. Maybe they do, but the reason they came to Carnegie Hall and to Shea was Sid.
I don't know if they interviewed him. They may have before he passed away.
But, we have so much tape. I have so many it's not like Sid was here, Sid on the air. We've got Sid told that story so many times. I would have paid to get to Ron Howard to say, here's Sid's story.
Well, I did some radio shows with Sid over the years in New York.
Sure.
And I also did QVC with him.
Right.
And he was selling posters for Carnegie Hall.
Right.
And he was, as he would say, he was a fabulous man. And he was just a terrific guy. And there are other people I would like to have seen. Ivor Davis, young reporter for the Daily Mirror. All these people were interviewed. And I think what they had to do, and let me tell you where they got their material from. They got half of their material from 8mm movies.
Yeah.
And they got a lot of their material from these 8mm movies that no one knew existed, like San Francisco Craziness on the field there. They also did extraordinary research. And my favorite part of the movie was the fact that young people, and if you're 50 years old right now, and you weren't there for the Beatles' arrival, okay? You have to be right now about 60 or 65, right? Right, somewhere around there?
Well,
65. And so here's what happens. You go to the movie, And I said last night that there's a thing called National History Month, and every year since I've been writing books, I receive about 50 requests for interviews because the kids want to win the competition.
Right.
This year, I got 600 requests. And
That's
I
because of
can't-
the movie, isn't it?
Because of the movie, and I can't do it. And Scholastic Press, which is the number one reacher of students, they're in 50,000 classrooms. Broadcast a special with Whoopi Goldberg as the host, and with Dave Grohl and Stevie Van Zandt, and I was part of that. And they reached such a young audience that they turned on the country. And when young people see it, and by the way, I've tell you a story about my grandson.
Oh, yes.
My grandson is in, as part of a gift from my wife, is in this a thing. I'm sure they have stuff like it up here, a School of Rock. It's where the kids get together, they play different instruments, they love music. And he came home from one of them and he said, "Grandpa, we played music today of this group. They are sensational. They're called the Beatles. You ever hear of them?" And I said we got to have a talk. And we took him to see the movie. Now some of it was a little over his head, but when he saw me pop up in the movie, he stood up and started clapping, and he now understands who John, Paul, George, and Ringo. In fact, he said they called them John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And I'll tell you another quick story. We did an interview on the plane when they got the award from the magazine, the British magazine. I can't remember the name of it. And I did an interview with them, and as I was reaching around the back portion of the plane, they grabbed the mic. First it was John, then Paul grabbed the mic, then George, then Ringo. They actually followed that pattern, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And they knew in their heads that that's the way it was.
That's the pattern.
Yeah, but the movie was great, and watching people watch it was great, and I've seen it so many times, and I still can't get over it, and there are things I see that I completely forgot.
It re-energizes an entire new generation, and it's something I've said many times, and I'll say it again. There are certain outliers. There's always talent. There's always people of remarkable talent, and most we probably never hear of or know about because the breaks, it doesn't flow to us. It doesn't become popular. But I'm a big music fan, and I have good ears, and I mean it sincerely when I say Beethoven, Mozart, Gershwin, these four kids from Liverpool. Why is it 50 years on from this album? Why is it, 55 to 60 years from they first got together playing Chuck Berry songs? Here we are, talking about it with a full ballroom of people of all ages. You can write all the books in the world. Larry can tell you what happened, but everybody always asks why, and I don't think anybody will ever answer that
When
question.
the kids look at the movies today and they say, "Did you see Adelaide, Australia, where half the population came out?" I would like to end this on a funny note. I talked about the fact that there were three things that happened to me that I very rarely talked about. During the first concert, I was trampled by some kids on the way to the stage, and my nose was bloodied, and I sat down with a kid who had an ice cream cone. And he said, "Sit down, sir, and compose yourself." And I had blood all over my white shirt and my beautiful Robert Hall suit. And as I was talking to him, cream from the triple-decker custard was dripping into the crotch of my pants. I got to the plane. Now we're in the dark, so nobody sees me. I walk up the steps, and Captain McCartney is at the top. And he says, "Larry Kayne, what the hell is going on? You're a dangerous man." 5 days later, 6 days later in L.A. at a party at the Reginald Owens Mansion. And McCartney was at the piano with Peggy Lipton. Jane Mansfield was there.
Wow.
Sandra Dee. It was just unbelievable. Wow. And a woman came up to me and says, "What do you do, Larry?" I said what I was doing, and she said, "What a great gig to travel with the Beatles." I said, "What do you do?" And she started screaming. Now, I mean screaming. If you heard the screams, you'd call 911 if there was a 911 in those days. And she whispered, and everybody turned around. McCartney looks at me. Everybody else, Lennon shockingly looks at me. And she said, I am a professional screamer. I was just in a movie called The House of Wax with Vincent Price. Well, nobody heard that. All everybody thought was he did something to her. And McCartney said, you're a bad boy, Larry Kane.
You are a dangerous man, Larry.
A year later, I'll finish this one up, we're in their home in Benedict Canyon, and they invite me over, and they said, bring a bathing suit, otherwise we're going to throw you in. So I didn't bring a bathing suit, and John said, there's a bunch of store-bought bathing suits in my room. Go to my room and get one and put it on, otherwise we're throwing you in. So I go to the place, I put the bathing suit on, go into the bathroom to freshen up, and the bathroom is all fogged up with mist, and there's a woman standing there, and she's just gotten out of the shower. She was bronze and beautiful and seductive, and I put my hand out to shake her hand.
Man, you are James Bond.
I said, I am Larry Kane, and she put her hand out, and the towel dropped. And she said, I'm Joan Baez. And so I said, Joan, will you do me a favor? When we go out to meet the guys, would you not say anything about it? She said, oh, sure. So we went out, and she told them the whole story. And Paul McCartney said, I've always said you're a deceptive, dangerous man, Larry Kane. And it was a great relationship with him.
Here he is, our very own Austin Powers. Mr. Larry Kane, thank you so much, Larry. You'll be outside signing?
Yeah, I have some books.